Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. I'm Forrest, inviting you to explore more creation-centered ways of thinking and being, and deeper connection to our places. In this episode, I'll be in conversation with Christy Berghoef about what it means to work for change while staying grounded in sustaining relationships with people and nature. If you've listened to the last couple of podcast episodes, you'll be aware that one of the priorities of the podcast this year is exploring ways that we can practically engage in bold action in the pursuit of social and environmental justice. At the same time, we want to continue our emphasis on going deeper in our relationship with nature, which in turn sustains and empowers us to be change agents. That makes Christy Berghoef a good person to look to for wisdom that comes from experience. In our conversation today, she'll tell us about her journey from a conservative upbringing in rural Michigan to a very different life in Washington, D.C., and what it was like to return to her home in Michigan as a very different person. In that journey, which she recounts in a beautiful new book called Rooted, a Spiritual Memoir of Homecoming, Christy confronts the unraveling of her childhood faith, the complexities of parenting and ministry, and the spiritual power of rediscovering home. Rooted in the sacred ground of her family's 40-acre farm, Christy tells us what it's been like to explore themes of spiritual transformation, social justice, parenting, and what it has meant for her to be in deep relationship to her place. And one particularly germane topic we'll discuss is what it sometimes costs for ourselves and our families to take a stand for truth in the face of sometimes fierce resistance. Christy, I really appreciate your taking time to be in conversation today about your book, Rooted, a Spiritual Memoir of Homecoming. I wonder if you could give our listeners a sense of context. Perhaps tell us about the place you live and the sorts of activities that you're invested in these days.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, Forrest. I'm really just grateful to be joining your community today. So I live on a small family farm on the south side of a little town called Holland in the state of Michigan. So we're on the west coast, just right near the lakeshore of Lake Michigan. And I grew up on this little 40-acre farm. It's been in the family for generations. And my husband and I are actually pastor church planters. So we've been starting faith communities around the country. So after seminary, I left home and we've lived in a variety of places. Eventually, we ended up coming back here to my hometown, and my parents had purchased a little house on the corner of their property that my grandparents had built and moved into in their old age, with the hope that one day maybe one of their kids would come and move back. So we bought that house, we moved into it, and I'm now back on the farm here, and we are raising our 4 kids here. We started a new church in the United Church of Christ in Holland, which is a pretty conservative town, pretty conservative area. So it was just a little something different to offer for people. I do a lot of contemplative photography. I'm leading retreats and pilgrimages. I do a lot of writing. And I'm a civil discourse consultant. So I'm involved in lots of different kind of things.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about some of those things. You have a very fascinating life. But I wonder if you could give us a sense of what the book is about. Why this book at this time in your life?
When we moved back here to West Michigan, which, as I said, is a pretty conservative area, I had previously written a book about a lot of the changes I had undergone because I grew up in this very conservative context, about some theological changes that happened in my life, which led to political changes and different views on social issues. So I had written that about 10 years ago. And then when we moved back here, we thought we were done with ministry. We were burned out, we were exhausted, and it didn't go that way. We ended up going back into ministry. There's a long story behind that. But what I began to hear was so many people coming forward in my community and sharing that they have gone through these changes as well, but they feel very much alone. And it's hard to be in a place where you have to stay quiet in order to be accepted, in order to feel loved. And it really just started compelling me to think about how I've been able to come back now as a villain in the community I grew up in, being a liberal, and kind of create a space for myself, to carve out a space. So there's one aspect of coming home, the hardness of that. Can you ever really come home? And I believe the answer to that is yes. But then the other aspect of the book is this deep connection to the land. So rekindling this relationship that I had with the land when I was growing up. And we did not have a lot growing up. I walked around in my brother's hand-me-downs, and there were times where we didn't know if there would be food at the end of the week. But we had the land, so I never felt lacking, because that was where I got my pleasure, my joy. I felt like the whole world was mine growing up. So to come home and know that that land knows me, I know the land, we have this intimate relationship. No matter what goes on in the world, I can always fall back on the land, and I can be loved and accepted as I am and restored, quite frankly. So that's why I wrote the book, to in part help people reconnect with land, connect with place, and the healing of that, as well as you can do this. Just because you're different in a place doesn't mean it can't be home.
Well, this idea of home, for you, it's very literal. It's a physical place. But I'm thinking about the people who don't maybe have options like that. You're pretty upfront in the book about your awareness of the privilege you have of having this family farm to go back to and to cultivate relationship with. I'm wondering, though, if you could speak to the majority of folks who don't have those options, or people who maybe are living in an urban context or due to socioeconomics don't really have a lot of flexibility in terms of where they live. Does this concept of home still apply to them?
I think it does. And one of the things I talk about in the book, and that I've come to discover, is home is that place where you can be exactly who you are. It's where you can be honest with who you are, and you're still loved in spite of it. And I have felt at home in many places. We lived in Washington, D.C. for a time, for example, on one of the busiest streets in the city. It was not the nicest part of town. And we found home there, and I can find land. And sometimes it was as much as, here is a piece of grass between my house and the sidewalk, and to take my shoes off and just step in the grass and look up and see the sky, or neighborhood parks. So those are places I could connect with the earth wherever we were, and finding those people who will love me and accept me despite everything I believe, despite my views. In fact, I would say we have found really rich kinds of family and belonging in other places as well.
Well, I'll confess, and this is entirely about me, that as I read your book, I was kind of uneasy at first, because it felt to me like an invitation to escape. You explain that you left a fairly trying and hectic situation and moved back to your family farm. And the book then becomes focused on this process of deepening your relationship with the land and on restoration and the inspiration you receive from the land. And honestly, the richness of your writing was so evocative and your storytelling so engaging that it was really impossible for me not to be drawn into this, what felt like a pretty idyllic, almost magical experience of place.
Yeah.
My worry was that this was a book about escape and retreat from the challenges of the world. And while that felt good to me as a reader, it also concerned me because it made me so aware of my own escapist tendencies that sometimes make me want to walk away from my commitments to work for environmental justice or advocate for creation. And I just moved to an island on the coast of Washington State, and I now live in a log house in the midst of the forest. And for me personally, I am more aware than ever these days of my own weariness of fighting the good fight, but also the temptation just to walk away and abandon myself to a life focused on my relationship with nature.
Yeah.
So when I started reading your book, I thought, oh no, this is the last thing I need right now is encouragement to walk away from the activist life and give over to isolation. But pretty soon as I continued reading, I was relieved that you began to talk about some really hard realities. And that if anything, your relationship to the land ended up empowering you to face those challenges.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that tension that really permeates the writing as I read it, that tension between the contemplative life, grounded in experience of the natural world on the one hand, and engagement with doing good and working for social change on the other. In your view, how do those two different modes of living come together?
Yeah. So in our ministry, my husband and I had been doing church planting for about 10 or 12 years before we moved back here. So engaging in issues that were impacting people in our communities was very much a part of our ministry. So we were constantly out there working for social justice, advocating for people who didn't have a voice, trying to change laws. And when we first moved back here, it was just, like a deep, deep breath. And I write about this, I come home, I sink my feet into the soil. As soon as I get home, I step in the field. It's just been freshly turned over, and it's just this huge exhale. And for about 2 years, I was mostly just resting in the earth. And then, you can only be comfortable there for so long because you know what's going on in the world. And so after this big period of rest, I was invited by an organization to go down to the southern border to do some writing and some photographing of some of these various ministries that were helping with immigrants who are coming over. And it was just awakening. Oh, yeah, this is real. There are real people being impacted by horrible policies. And you cannot stay in this comfortable place and forget about what's going on out there, because that is privilege right there, right? And so at that point, I started going back and forth, jumping all in to social justice issues, leading protests and rallies and organizing marches and organizing writing to members of Congress on a variety of issues and jumping all in. And then I got so exhausted and burned out from the work that I jumped all the way back into, I got to put that all away. And I just left it, went back to the earth. And so I waffled like that for a while until I began to realize there's a balance here that I need to strike. And that is, I can have one foot in the world at all times and one foot in the earth at all times. So I'm constantly being nourished and restored. I'm constantly learning lessons that are everywhere in nature that's teaching us how we should be living in the world. And I can keep one foot in this world where I'm constantly aware and constantly using my voice and using my privilege. So I end up finding this balance. It's imperfect. It's always something I'm seeking and chasing after. So that's kind of where I end up, where, I'll sit in my pollinator garden, for example, and I'll just watch this remarkable thing that happens, this mutualism in the natural world. And I am so inspired. That's how we should be living with each other and in relationship with the earth. So then I really work for that and I strive for that. So now I just incorporate a daily time of meditation and silence and stillness into my day, and then I get busy out in the world. Yeah.
I wonder if you wouldn't mind reading from your book a bit. I want people to hear the language of your book, which is pretty beautiful. This passage was, to me, a reminder about the source, about what we need to come back to, about what's really important.
Yes. As my eyes scan the remarkable earthscape, I feel held, cradled in the warm arms of Mother Earth. She accepts my body and receives my tears without question. She sees and knows what is happening across the surface of her own flesh. Wars tear into her. Unfettered consumption scrapes and gouges her, and then fills garbage heaps that seep poison into her. The engines of progress cough, chug, and churn without taking into account the slow killing of everything. She preaches, the great Reverend Mother Earth, but the world turns its ears away from her wisdom because we're too busy listening to the swell of our own puffed-up voices, our own theories, our own doctrines, our own ideas. Consider the lilies of the field, a great teacher once said. But who has time for that? It would require that we sit still and keep quiet. It would necessitate that we stop clamoring and reaching and shouting and spouting and grabbing all the things we are told to want but do not need. She shows us exactly what we need, demonstrates how we ought to live, preaches timeless truths, and dazzles with ever-unfolding mysteries. Her existence inspires deep awe and wonder.
Thank you. You know what? One thing I took away from the book was, not just that we can find the balance, we can do both, but in a way we need to do both, right? To have that time of restoration, of reconnection, of information that nature gives us makes us more effective, maybe more sustainable in terms of doing work in the world. Would you say that's true, that it's actually a balance that you recommend to people?
I absolutely recommend it. And at the same time, I am aware that not everyone can step out back and have access to this. And that's very real. And for a lot of people who are living in the city, certainly in the neighborhood we lived in, it takes effort to go to the park or your backyard. If you have a backyard, many people don't, but it takes some effort. So I also realize there are people who are oppressed by many, many systems who also don't have access and don't have the energy to fight for justice either, right? So it's more thinking, what do I have and what can I do with what I have, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And as you speak, I realize that a lot of people, myself included, sometimes we place our identity too much in the things that we're doing and the significance of our work. And as I read your story, it's almost a story of putting your identity in a different place. Like you're grounding your being and your purpose for being in your experience with the natural world, rather than in that work, say, of social justice or photography or what have you.
Yeah.
Am I reading that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think that stuff flows naturally when you realize your place in this world, your place on the earth. You're just another one of these species in a whole realm of species. And I know it's grounding, and yes, it allows the work in the world to just come naturally, in my experience.
And maybe puts that work in perspective too.
Yeah.
Just in terms of what's really important in remembering who you are and what you're for.
Yeah.
Well, in chapter 9, you really adeptly describe the divisiveness that characterizes social and political discourse these days.
Yeah.
And you yourself have done a lot of work to promote civil dialogue. And you used two terms in your writing that I found interesting: toxic tribalism and communal belonging.
Yeah.
Would you tell us more about those two dynamics, and maybe even what nature teaches us about moving away from one and toward the other?
Sure. So when I talk about toxic tribalism, essentially, we all, as humans, we have this need to belong. We have a need to be part of a tribe. And that goes way back to our very beginnings, I would say. And when tribalism becomes toxic is when we build walls around our way of living and our way of being and our way of understanding the world. And we defend them against all the other views out there, against all the other tribes. So it comes with this need to attack others, essentially. And when I think about communal belonging, I have a very different picture. It's more a village without the walls. And we have each other and we hold each other and we have a lot of similarities, but it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to question the authority figures in your community. And we engage with other people from their communities and we exchange ideas and we grow from each other. We learn from each other. So it's very different from a toxic tribe where, and this gets a little bit into sociology, but when in a toxic tribe, if you question authority, your place in the tribe diminishes. You might be kicked out, you might be punished. And the louder you are, and more violent even sometimes your rhetoric is within a toxic tribe, the more celebrated you are and lifted up as kind of a hero. So I think we have pretty extensive toxic tribalism going on in our country today. And if we could just move towards a sense of communal belonging, which I see again in my pollinator garden. I go back there all the time because the flower is helping the bee, is helping the flower, is helping the bee, is helping the butterfly, is helping the flower. Everyone is participating in this beautiful thing. They have their own home place. They have their community, whether it's by roots underground or in a hive. And they have this mutualism. They need each other. They need each other to be healthy. So that's something that I see in the garden that always inspires me.
I'm really curious. You used the word villain to describe your sense of yourself and your family coming back into this context where your views were not necessarily in sync with the majority. How has that actually evolved, that place in society where you live now? And just in terms of moving away from toxicity, what does that actually look like in practical terms for you and your family?
So when we moved back, our views had changed so drastically while we were away. When we came back, there was kind of this sense of, okay, fall back into your place now. Go back to that place where you were. I felt the pressure around me. We had to very quietly start sharing our views and very carefully. And to back up even a little bit more, growing up here, the values that were instilled in me are the same values I still embrace. But I've seen a different context. I've seen different parts of the world. I've seen different human realities. I've seen human suffering in new and different ways. I've come to see the realities of systemic injustice. When I grew up in my little white, middle-class, Christian, Republican, rural silo, I just wasn't aware of those realities. And so I think coming back here, I also had to come with the attitude that I know these are good-hearted people. I know that even though they disagree with me, even though they might attack in different ways, I know that they are doing the best with what they know. I was when I was growing up here, and I treated people like me the way I was treated. So I also knew that. So we knew what was coming, and we just tried to be very loving, explained when people asked questions or would attack us. We would counter with a question, or we would counter with a story. Well, here's what we've seen in the world. So this is how we've seen this system impact these people, and we care about those people, and we think God cares about those people. So that's why our views have changed. So we never want to come back and say, you're terrible, actually. You don't know anything. You don't know what's going on in the world, right? You can't come back with that attitude because then no one wants to hear what you have to say. And it's just simply not true. There are a lot of things we don't know. There's a lot of realities we haven't seen. We all are doing the best we can with what we understand. I believe that.
I remember in the book at one point you talked about gathering people to you who maybe felt a bit estranged as you did, who maybe felt on the outside of the mainstream, and giving them a place to be, which kind of comes back to that concept of home. We know that a lot of the listeners to this podcast, they listen to the podcast because they feel alone. They are in contexts like that where particularly environmental issues or their view of climate change tends to isolate them or earn them criticism and even isolation. I wonder if you could give advice to those folks. You're talking in ways that make it clear it's much more than just about survival, right? There's something more proactive and maybe even more humble in your approach to that dynamic. What would you say to folks who are trying to make their way in contexts where their views are just not really well received?
Yeah. Well, I would say, for one thing, in my ministry life, most of what I do, technically, I'm the music director at our church. Most of what I do is sit with people exactly like this, who come from all over our community, who, for a variety of reasons, have been made to feel small or unwelcome in their churches and in their community and in their families, people who are cut off because they care about the environment or because they have different political views. And one of the things I always say is, say something, because you are not alone. And it always turns out that so many people think they're alone. They might be going to the same church and they think they're alone. But if you slowly and gently start to raise questions or say something, those people will come to you. There are more, I promise you, and they will find you and you find each other. That's how our church got started. It's people finding each other, and then it just naturally sprung up from there.
Yeah, that feels really important, that advice. You're recommending a stance of courage, which might be hard to come by, but I think you're right, though, that probably people in their fear might be assuming that they are the only people who think that way, right?
When my first book came out, which was about that journey of everything changing and trying to navigate life and ministry that way, we were in a conservative denomination at that time. And it was absolutely terrifying. But the most response I got from other pastors in our denomination at the time, from Christian college professors, from Christian school teachers, from folks in conservative communities was this: I thought I was alone. That's what most people said. I thought I was alone. Now I know I'm not alone. And in my experience, the more I began saying it and talking about it, people just flock because there are so many people and they are afraid because it's hard. And sometimes it can really cost you something. We have people in our church, for example, that have lost their lifelong friends because they voted for a Democrat. There are people who have been cut out of their families because of how they voted or who they love or how they've come to understand the gospel, all of that. So you are not alone. I promise you're not alone. There are always people wrestling in the shadows.
It seems to me that the argument for reaching out and speaking up in order to find those people goes beyond just feeling like you're not alone. I think it's important that we belong to people of like heart and mind in order to be effective. Maybe in order to have more courage to speak truth, more courage to work for things that we believe in that may work against the status quo.
Yeah. Yeah. And truly, that is such a rich and powerful kind of community to be with because you have been through those same painful experiences and struggles. And then from that, you can just birth something really beautiful and create something, some kind of light in your community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that for that reason alone, it's a reason to read this book, especially for people in those situations. I think it's very encouraging. Yeah. Well, I want to switch tracks a little bit to something you said earlier. You grew up on the family farm with your siblings, where you now live, and experienced a lot of freedom to run wild, so to speak.
Yes.
And I found myself both laughing and cringing a bit when you described some of the risky and even dangerous things you got up to as a kid. And I was cringing because my childhood was similarly wild. And now that I'm a parent, my heart skips a beat when I recall the crazy things that my friends and siblings and I got up to in the woods and the lakes and canyons where we lived. And while my parents didn't know about the most reckless things that we did, they still allowed us a lot of freedom to roam far from home and be unsupervised in those wild spaces. Mm-hmm. And I know without a doubt, and I was thinking about this as I read your stories, I know without a doubt that those experiences of freedom and even the risks that we took shaped me into the person I am today.
Yeah.
Yet still, as a parent, it was difficult for me to allow my daughter to experience that degree of freedom. So I wonder if you would tell us about how you as a parent understand the importance of wildness in the formation of children.
Yeah, sure. It's funny. When we first moved to Washington, D.C., and we have 4 kids, we pulled up our minivan in front of our house. And our neighbors later tell this story. They said, we looked out the window to see who's here, who's the new neighbors. And it's like we just kept seeing kids jump out of the van. And we thought, what in the world? Who has 4 kids? And coming from spaces that always felt naturally safe to us, we didn't have a lot of guardrails on them, even in D.C. at the time. And we would let our kids walk to the park, go there by themselves 2 blocks away. I just didn't think this is something dangerous. And then there was a news story about a woman whose kids were taken away because she let them walk to school or the park or something by themselves. And I thought, oh my goodness, can this happen? So then we started watching over them a little bit more because I was like, I guess the rules are different in a big city. So we were a little more careful, but still, the day we moved from Washington, D.C., we had this big yard sale. Now, my son, Winston, he used to collect rocks. So while we were selling our stuff, this old woman came up and she said, oh, you must be Winston's parents. And we said, yeah, we are. And she said, oh, yeah, he knocked on my door one day and came and he sold me a rock. And, so I bought this little rock from him. And, he's always up and down the streets knocking on doors. And I thought, I didn't even know that. I had no idea. But then we moved back here and we just, we really did a little bit of wild parenting, I will say, when we moved back to the farm. But it's a beautiful 40 acres. There's rolling hills and open fields and ponds and trails through the woods. And so sometimes my kids would get up in the summer, take off, and I wouldn't see them till almost evening. And they're literally catching their fish in the pond, and they build a fire, and they cook their fish, and they eat them. The kind of stuff I did growing up. If you're hungry, we'll pick an apple from an apple tree or pull a carrot up from the garden. So that's how I grew up. And I thought it was pretty special. And as you mentioned, I think it formed me in different ways. So we did let our kids do that here as well. When I think of electronic devices today, it's a huge concern for me that kids are glued to these things. They're growing up with these things. And I think it's pulling them away not only from books, but I think it's pulling them away from being outside. When I was a kid, it's like you wake up and you run outside. It's the first thing on your mind. So it worries me, that detachment from earth and nature. How is that going to impact the interior of a person over time? I write this chapter, it's called When Left to Their Own Devices. And in there, I talk about how we had gotten an iPad. And we said everyone had 20 minutes a day. That's it. And then we would put it away and they would sneak it. And then I would hide it and they would find it. I was so infuriated. At one point, I just got up. I took the device. I unplugged the television because I didn't even want that. And I just said, there's no screens this summer. And after a few days of absolute horror and, of course, being told you're the worst, meanest mom in the world for doing this, it was amazing to see what they did. They created things. They made their own fun, like I had to do when I was a kid. They spent way more time outside. It was beautiful, and they played together better than they ever had. They weren't fighting over who gets the iPad next. They were building whole worlds in the sandbox together. It was absolutely amazing. So I lament that that's one of the things that is being lost, I think, with this rise of technology.
I talk to young parents and whoever will listen to me. I say, be brave enough to put limits on devices. I think my daughter's generation was the great experiment. We didn't know what we know now. We didn't know the impact of devices and how that would change their lives and their perception of reality. So I actually have some hope that people are picking up on that and realizing from having seen the costs that maybe they need to be a lot more circumspect about access to devices for their kids.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Well, your family faced really trying and even scary times when your husband, Brian, decided to run for a seat in the U.S. Congress. And I was struck by the fact that you both stayed committed to this difficult process, even when you saw how much it was impacting the lives of your kids.
Yeah.
Tell us the story, if you would, about that decision and about the impact of that experience on your kids.
Yeah. So after our church had been around for about 5 or 6 years, one of the primary things our community of faith was doing together was working in the community. There's a lack of homes for people. How can we achieve affordable housing? How can we advocate for a stronger education? How can we advocate for things like SNAP benefits? And we had been leading marches and protests as well on a variety of issues. And so the Democratic Party took notice and asked him to run. And first he said, no way, I'm a pastor. I don't want to run. After a few months of them talking to him, he finally said, you know what? I've been advocating to my member of Congress on behalf of these people. Our community has been doing all this work, and we get no response. We don't even hear back. So you know what? Yes, I will. So he did. And it was kind of a shock, I think, to this area that a pastor was running as a Democrat. To a lot of people, it didn't make sense. And one of the things he said from the get-go is, I am not going to participate in the kinds of slanderous tactics that are typically used in campaigns. I'm still a pastor, and I'm a father, and my kids are watching, and my community is watching. I will not lie about my opponent. I will not say things that aren't true. I won't go to extremes to try and make him look bad. If he does something that I appreciate, I'm going to say it. And so we had to first fight against that a lot. You wouldn't believe the pressure within the party to go dark and ugly. That's how you win. You go dark and ugly. Well, one of his goals was to try and build bridges between the two parties. And so he did these things during his campaign events. He went all around the district. He said, I'm not here to make a campaign speech. All I want to do is get Republicans and Democrats around the tables together, and he had questions for them to discuss. And that was it. He's like, that's all I want to do. I want you to talk to each other. So people would get together and they would talk and then realize at the end of the night, oh, we actually all kind of want the same sort of world. We want our kids to have a good education. We want our kids to be healthy and fed, and we want life to be affordable, and we want healthcare to be accessible. Of course, we all want these things. Even though we might disagree on how to get there, at the heart, we share these same values. So why are we so mad at each other? Why are we hating each other? Why are we slinging stones and mud and grit and beating each other down like the other is the enemy? And then the realization that, oh, our politicians are making us feel this way. It's part of their tactic to make us hate the other, so we fight for them. So it was kind of an experiment, and it generated a really interesting response from the community and from people. And more Republicans voted Democrat that year in the district than had been on record, and he got more votes than any Democrat had. But did not win, of course. It's a solidly red district. And he knew that going in. He knew, I'm doing this to try and model something different, to try and say there's a better way. But the extremists are in every community. Both parties have them. And this was 2020. And there was some really awful things that began to happen. We had a lot of drive-by incidents by our house, people throwing things, leaving things in our mailbox, people shouting, all kinds of terrible things. And then online, of course, when you're not face-to-face with someone, you're even more emboldened to say awful things. So during the pandemic, a Facebook group sprung up called Michiganders Against Quarantine. And people were really upset, obviously, with our governor. This is the group in which people banded together, found each other, made this plan to kidnap the governor, take her out to the middle of Lake Michigan and drown her. Eventually, these people were arrested, but some of these same groups started making comments about my husband. Without knowing him, without understanding his views, without knowing what he was trying to do, they saw a D beside his name, and things spiraled out of control really quickly. He had previously done an event in which the governor came, supported him, and so someone posted a picture of him with the governor in this Facebook group. And the comment was, I bet this guy is in favor of masks and quarantines. And then hundreds of comments below that just kept deteriorating until the point where people were saying, well, let's go give him hell. Does anyone have his address? Oh, I'm going to do this to his wife and his daughter. My daughter was 11 at the time. We're going to make him watch. So no one at any point stepped in and said, hey, guys, this is out of hand. What are you saying? We're not like this. And so the comments deteriorated. And then someone said, well, what's his address? Someone find his address. And then our address was posted in the group. And then things really ratcheted up. And we had to move out of our house a few times during the campaign because of these kinds of things. Our kids at the time were in a Christian school because one of my sons has a severe learning disability. He has dyslexia. And this was one school that had this amazing program. And it was really bad for our kids. I won't go into everything except to say they probably will be working through it for a long time to come. Some of the things that happened to them there. It got very hard. It got very ugly. But we never thought, let's pull out because, I don't know, you think you've got people who are counting on you. Something is happening. Something's changing. There's something shifting in the air because of the way he was campaigning. And also, when these things were all public, it exposed some ugly underbelly, I think, of what was going on in a part of the Republican Party at that time. And that made people step back and go, wow, is this who I am? Am I part of a party where people are saying these kinds of things? And of course, Donald Trump was talking that way about people all the time. So it had kind of been normalized. But we never thought, let's stop. When we were in D.C., we did a lot of work learning about the civil rights era, understanding what people went through, what they sacrificed. And what we were experiencing seemed so small compared to what so many people went through for their rights. So again, it came down to this question of, we're privileged. We have everything we need, but so many people don't, and they don't have a voice. And here's an opportunity for us to bring their voices to the table. So we have to do that. And we talked about it with our kids, and ultimately our kids were pulled from the Christian schools because it got so ugly. But we never thought, let's not do this. We always knew we had to keep doing it. And we talked it through with the kids.
Well, you noted that they may be dealing with trauma in their futures from this experience, but looking back, I wonder, can you say with confidence, with surety, that actually there were good things that might come of that experience for your children in particular?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was interesting for them to sometimes come to things. We never pressured them ever. We always said, if you want to come to this event, you can. And so sometimes they would come and meet all these amazing people around the district and hear different stories, very different from their own. One of our fears in leaving Washington, D.C. was that our kids would forget. They would forget the stories of their classmates. And it was a pretty underprivileged area where we lived. So there were some tough stories. Moving here to a relatively well-off area, primarily white, particularly in their Christian schools. And kids had these attitudes like, well, if you're poor, it's because you don't work hard, right? Hearing things like that, attitudes like that, kids saying terrible things about immigrants, and them thinking, all my friends were immigrants at the school I went to. And their parents were the hardest working people I've ever seen, and they are still living in poverty. They kind of came of age here. They were younger in D.C., and our fear was that they would forget. That was one of our biggest fears. And so when Brian ran for Congress, one of the things it did is it brought back the opportunity for us to talk about some of the circumstances their friends had been living in and to understand the systemic issues around that were holding them in those places.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions I personally want to be asking in this 7th season of the podcast has a lot to do with children. How do we raise our kids in ways that make them realize that safety is not a guarantee for people who want to make change, and that we sometimes need to take a stand with our very lives? And this story that you just told, that appears in your book, to me really spoke about the difficulty of making those decisions, but also the potential benefits in terms of who our children grow up to be. I'm kind of in awe. And I will just love to know where they are in 5-10 years, right? And how they're carrying that wisdom from the experience forward, even as maybe they process some of the trauma.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we lived in Washington, D.C., one of the organizations I was working for did a lot of work with Congressman John Lewis, who has since passed, of course. But one of the things they did was lead an annual civil rights pilgrimage. John Lewis would lead this. And growing up where I did, we never talked about the civil rights movement. The only thing I knew about the whole civil rights era was this guy, Martin Luther King, came along and he gave this I Have a Dream speech. That's all I knew. And so when I was in D.C., I learned so much. Our kids were in a primarily Black school, and they're immersed in this rich history that I never learned growing up here. When we moved back to Michigan and our kids were in the Christian school, I talked to some of the school administrators and I said, hey, do you think any of the students would be interested in a civil rights pilgrimage or even a Black history pilgrimage? They said, well, yeah, let's throw it out there. I love this idea. So I led this pilgrimage, took 7th and 8th graders down south. We first looked at slavery, and we talked about that. And at every point, I asked these kids, where do you think you would have stood at this time in history? And, they're 7th and 8th graders. Of course, they want to believe I would have been an abolitionist, or of course, I would have been freeing the slaves. It was terrible. I would never allow that. And then we would talk about Reconstruction, and then we would talk about the Civil Rights era. And we would say, where do you think you would have been? Do you think you would have participated in the marches? Do you think you would have stayed home because you would be afraid of losing your job? Would you have been silent? Would you have spoken up? Everyone says, I would have been in the streets marching for the rights of people. And then we go to the Human and Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta. And we start at the bottom of this museum, and you're walking through the Civil Rights era, and it spirals up. And by the time you get to the top, here are all the human rights issues going on in the world right now. Talking about Black Lives Matter, talking about mass incarceration, talking about sweatshops, talking about all these different things. And then we sat there and I said, so here's where we are today. Where are you going to stand? And that question was kind of left hanging in the air with them.
As you noted in your book, Americans are living in some pretty awful times when it comes to politics and economics and social division. Of particular interest to listeners to the Earth Keepers podcast are issues around global warming or environmental destruction. And while this podcast encourages people to be more earth honoring in their daily habits and also to deepen their relationship with their local ecologies, I have a growing sense that people are yearning to be more engaged in work that's more impactful, that leads to more systemic change that goes beyond recycling or contemplative walks in the woods. What would you say to those listeners who want to be more of a force for change when it comes to fighting for environmental justice or working to oppose ecological exploitation?
Well, for starters, I think it's important just to learn. Our church has really gotten involved in environmental issues. And for us, has started with, we sit around people who have really been involved in this work, who have really transformed their lives in big ways, and sitting with them and absorbing their wisdom, hearing from them how it's changed their life. Also, this is so anti-American, it's so countercultural, but one of the big things we've focused on is living with less. What do we actually need? Really thinking differently about your life, stepping back and saying, why do we need that? And I often talk about my grandmother who grew up on the South Dakota prairie during the Great Depression. She was there during the Dust Bowl, and she had 2 dresses and she wore them for years. We are just so consumer minded. Keep buying and keep buying and keep spending. And so one of the things we have focused on is really paring down in that way. We're one family, we're one church, but if everyone starts thinking in this totally different mindset, I think it could really have an impact. Imagine if all people of faith said, yeah, we're going to take that command to care for the earth seriously. And ultimately, the earth cares for us as well.
You are answering that question not solely in individual terms, what my family can do, what changes I am making, but you're constantly tacking back and forth to the broader community. And it seems to me that perhaps one of your callings, and maybe Brian's as well, is to help people to do things together.
Yeah.
To think in terms of community. And that does lead to more systemic change when you're doing it with other people, when you're trying to broaden the impacts of these changes that do happen on the individual level, but have everything to do with the community around you as well.
Yeah. Definitely. Absolutely. One of the exciting things I see in our community, and I think this is happening in more places around the country and maybe the world, outdoor education, where kids are learning outside. So a lot of our nature preserves in this area now have schools where they do most of their learning outside, where the kids are outside in all weather. And I think it's so, so beautiful.
Thinking forward to the future, it's like long-term investment to say, what if we gave these kids these certain kinds of learning opportunities? What then can we hope they will become, just in terms of agents of change?
Yeah. I have a lot of hope that maybe seeds are planted in the minds of these kids, in the hearts of these kids. Maybe they're developing a kind of love for the earth and want to care for the environment because they have a relationship with it. It invites a whole new level of thinking about how we interact with it. So I have a lot of hope for that as well.
Friends, I don't know about you, but for me, there are so many takeaways from this conversation with Christy. I'm left with lots of really challenging questions that I'll be ruminating on for a good while. And so many of those questions imply essentially practical, action-oriented responses. At one point, Christy asked, how do we make space at the table for voices that often go unheard? If you recall from our conversation in the last podcast episode with Randy Woodley, that's exactly the challenge he was posing to us as well. How can we listen better to others? Or even to create contexts of listening for groups of people, safe spaces where people of seemingly wildly different views can really hear one another and maybe discover what they have in common underneath their disagreements. I also appreciated Christy's unflinching assumption that, of course, we all need to be engaged in the work of social and environmental justice. Sure, we need to figure out our unique abilities and capacities so that we're doing the kind of work we're most effective at, but everybody can do something, and more than ever, the world needs us to step up and commit to action. But of course, it isn't all about action, right? I mean, if we want our efforts to be impactful, most of us should probably not be acting alone. Instead, we would do well to work together in community with others who also care about the things we care about. Community makes the work more sustainable. And maybe, just as important, being grounded and in relationship with nature in some ways also empowers our work, especially the work of earth care. But as a parent, perhaps the question that moved me most deeply in this conversation was this: how can we raise our children to be deeply curious and open-minded, to nurture them in ways that expose them to very different views and teach them to be listeners and truth speakers at the same time? Even more, how do we instill in them the courage to face rejection and the resilience to stand strong in the face of resistance? For me, I was reminded in this conversation that investing in future generations is one of the most radically important ways we can spend ourselves. In particular, both Earth Keepers and our home organization, Circlewood, stand firmly with Christy in her belief in the importance of raising up the next generation to be future advocates for creation and environmental change makers. In that way, we all need to stand for the future, don't we? So, whatever might have resonated with you from this episode, let's get to work figuring out how we might respond to the particular challenges in the particular places where we live. Earth Keepers podcast is a production of Circlewood. Our executive producer is James Amidon, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our communications manager, and our music was created by Forrest Reed and Levgen Potovsky. I am Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host, and I'm really grateful for the time you've spent listening to this episode. Help us expand our reach by following or subscribing to this podcast on your favorite listening platform. And be sure to go to earthkeepers.online to sign up for our podcast newsletter. If you know someone who would benefit from hearing this podcast conversation, it would be great if you could send them a link. In any case, I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earth Keepers podcast.